Okay, we talked about rhyme and such. We talked about the sonnet. Probably the most important form, poetic form in English literature is what's called blank verse. Blank verse. That is not the same as free verse. Say some things about that. It's blank verse. And what it is unrhymed iambic pentameter. So it has no rhyme, but it does have rhythm. It does have a particular rhythm. Now, this is the form that's used for epic, and classical literature curriculums do a lot with the epic form. In English epic, but also in a lot of the good translations of the Greek epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Roman epic, the Aeneid. Now, unrhymed iambic pentameter. Now, the beauty of this form is that by not having rhyme, it has the advantages of prose and the advantages of poetry. Okay, so when you read it, you don't get distracted by the rhymes. You don't get into the dinky, 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 dinky. Because typically epic, at least, is exalted. It doesn't have these little pretty little touches like rhyme, which kind of brings it down a little bit. So it has the advantage of oral storytelling, but it also, because it's poetry, written in lines, written with very strict requirements for the line, the iambic, man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. So it's poetic, and because it's written with the poetic line, with the rhythm, again, every word counts. Every word is painting a picture in that multi-dimensional way that words have, that we've talked about. And so when you're reading epic or teaching epic, again, it's not a novel. I mean, you can treat it like a novel, just as the story. And maybe a lot of the time you spend on it are going to have to be kind of in that way. This is narrative poetry that tells a story. But attend to find the key passages and look at every word. Look at what it's doing and let each word register in the imagination. And as you're reading it and teaching your students to read it, teach them to picture every word, because that's how it's really becoming amazing. This is the introduction to Milton's Paradise Lost, an epic poem about Adam and Eve. Write an epic poem about Adam and Eve to pick a fruit. That's the big turning point. But now, read Milton, read what he does with it. Read about the war in heaven, about the fall of Satan, which also happens and precedes the fall of Adam and Eve. And read about the restoration, and read about how Milton ties this into all of human history. Okay. I could spend the whole time, and I would like to do that on just those lines, but I better not. Let's move forward. The other thing about blank verse is it's really good for dramatic poetry. For plays, that's another genre, the drama, the play. And Shakespeare's works are written in blank verse. And that's really a great form because, again, it can function like conversation, and at the same time, and so you have the dialogue, characters talking back and forth in poetry, and so it can be as natural as conversation, and yet it has the intensity, the artistry of the greatest poetry. When you're teaching drama, some people say, well, okay, we've got to do Shakespeare, we'll watch a video of a Shakespeare play. Okay, that's good. And so that is how Shakespeare intended it to be performed. Yeah, true. But I urge you to read it and have your class read it and then show it as the play. Then show the video. For one thing, the modern productions always cut things out. And what they cut out is usually the Christian elements and lines that for us are really very precious and great. And they interpret it, they give it modern interpretations. Again, you can approach literature of the past in a different way. Here's an old story from hundreds of years ago. Let's see how it measures up to today. Oh, look at the bad attitudes they had, and they're intolerant, not like us. That is how literature is being taught in a lot of places, including universities. And you see how, that's a way to distance yourself from the past. And again, you can talk about absolutely the differences and the blind spots of a particular period. But what we mainly want is to learn from the past, to step out of our time. What are our blind spots? We're not even aware of those. We have them. And by reading literature of the past and looking at our times from their perspective, we can learn a lot more about our own times than when we read literature from our perspective and, put it down. But anyway, blank verse, dramatic poetry. To be or not to be, that is the question. And here's something else about poetic form. Okay, notice it's regular. That doesn't mean there aren't variations. Look what happens. To be or not to be, that is the question. Notice to be or not to be. That, it turns. The rhythm is reversed. And what good poets do is not just write like a metronome. No, they'll set up a rhythm so they can vary it. And when they vary it, that puts emphasis on certain words. To be or not to be, that is the question. Okay, now, you see how that is? This is Hamlet's soliloquy. And it's a soliloquy about, is it better to live or to die? Is it better to exist or not to exist? Hamlet is considering suicide. And this whole poem, this whole passage in Hamlet, it's a contemplation about suicide. And it's actually a very good way to talk about these issues, which is an issue for many young people, tragically, many older people. And what he does, he balances it. It's better to be. Shall we suffer? Is it noble to suffer all the bad things that are happening to me, or to do something about it? Take arms. Does somebody like to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? Unfortunate, just slinging things at him, shooting arrows at him. Again, using concrete, visual, imaginative language to picture. Again, you feel that way sometimes. Fortune, your luck, your bad luck, and just slinging things at you, shooting at you. Take arms against a sea of troubles like an ocean, just getting higher and higher by opposing in them. Well, there's allusions there. I believe it's to King Canute. There's images of a hero trying to, he can defeat everybody. And the ocean is coming up, the waves, stop waves, here, I'll show you. And of course, an image of total futility. But anyway, this turns into a meditation. Hamlet about talked himself into it's better to die, to cease, to sleep no more. How nice that would be. But then to sleep, perchance to dream. And then he starts realizing that there's something after death. And that he's going to exist, whether it's in this life or the next life. And he starts thinking about God's command. And later he says, oh, that the Almighty had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. He'd love to kill himself, but God says, no, thou shalt not kill. That applies to yourself as well as everybody. And he realizes he's got to fix. Anyway, I've had students that are talked out of suicide, out of suicidal thoughts by studying Hamlet, by studying this passage. Anyway, this is very intense poetry, and it's very wonderful, and it doesn't water anything down. I mean, yeah, a sea of troubles. I mean, he expresses the worst it can get, but then he works through that in a way that's very beneficial. But anyway, it's blank verse. Now, there is such a thing as free verse, poetry that has no rhyme or regular rhythm. It's still poetry because it has the lines, it's written in lines, and it's written in images. Again, free verse started mainly when people started reading poetry rather than just hearing it. And reading it silently instead of reading it aloud. So when you read it silently, you can see the lines. Okay, you can attend to the words and the images. So there's nothing wrong with free verse. One fun exercise you can do is to take a passage, take a paragraph that maybe has some description in it, and then write it in lines, and all of a sudden it turns into a poem. And sometimes it's very comical, to take a bland, news story and write as a poem, and all of a sudden it becomes hilarious. That's a fun. Put that in your toolbox. But T.S. Eliot, the greatest modernist poet, very radical in many ways, and in the new style he pioneers. But he became a Christian. A conservative Christian, and a very, very great writer. Again, we don't have time to talk about this. Signs are taken for wonders. We would see a sign. Notice how he's alluding to Scripture. The Pharisees and people, show us a sign. Show us a sign. The Word, within the Word. Okay, what is that? Well, the Word of God, the Christ, the Word. He's talking about the Word, unable to speak a word. Mentioned the baby Jesus. Here's the Word when he's just an infant and he can't talk. Wow, what a paradox. Here's the Word, unable to speak a word, but he's still the Word. Swaddled with darkness, wrapped in swaddling clothes. In darkness, in the pubescence of the year, the early part of the year, came Christ, the tiger. Oh, he's a little baby. Now he's a tiger. The ferocity of Christ, the strength of Christ. Later, it's actually in that same poem. It talks about Christ, the tiger, us he devours. And Christ devouring us. But first, notice, you can see a poet, he gives these images. He doesn't always connect them. You have to make the connection yourself. Christ, and in the context of it, this is the whole poem, you would know maybe more that it's talking about Jesus. The Word, the baby swaddled, darkness, and they would speak a word, and Christ the tiger. And then later in the poem, it talks about Christ the tiger devouring us. But look what happens here. In the jubilance of the year came Christ the tiger, and depraved May, dogwood and chestnut, flowering Judas, the images of spring, and like to be eaten, to be divided, to be drunk on whispers. So Christ the tiger came to be eaten. What was he talking about? Be divided, be drunk. What?
Holy Communion.
Holy Communion. Yeah, here now. Other part, everybody talks about Christ devouring us. Here we're devouring him, so to speak. Anyway, it's, reading this kind of, this is more challenging than the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And he's bringing these, and you have, it's a trap for meditation, and you have to meditate on it. I mean, you're reading this from the beginning, what? Well, let me understand it. Well, this is a poem that you've got to, contemplate and to think about and make the connection yourself. But when you're making them in your own mind, you're internalizing them. So when you realize, wow, the baby Jesus, Christ is a tiger, Aslan, the lion, but this is, anyway, it's just great poem. But there's no rhyme, no regular rhythm. The lines are of different lengths. That by no means means that it's lesser poetry or that it's modern and so it's no good. Some people talk about that. Oh, in free verse, say they've lost all order. No, there's an order in T.S. Eliot's poetry. It's sort of an internal order based on orchestrating the images that hang together in a very complex way. All right, let's move to fiction. Now, in a way, I'm talking about a different level because poetry you can write fiction and poetry. Again, epic poems, the Iliad, Aeneid, or other creations. Drama it sets up a narrative, a story. Maybe I should call this narrative. Fiction just means whether it's true or not. Some narratives are historical, some are fantasies. But they still are narratives. And when you tell a story, it's going to tend to have these formal elements. Every story is going to have these elements. Plot. Something has to happen to have a story. Characters. The action has to happen to somebody, or somebody has to perform the action. Setting. The story is going to happen somewhere. And there's a theme, the point of the story, the ideas that the story can give you. Let me tell just briefly about plot. Again, the action, it isn't just random actions. The actions are purposeful. They'll have a motivation, a direction. Every plot will have a conflict. And when you're studying a story, whether it's a nursery or whether it's a fairy tale or a novel, the best, quickest way into the story's meaning is by looking and helping your students say, okay, what is the conflict? You can't have a story where everything is nice and everything goes right and everybody lives happily ever after. I try with my grandkids. They want a story, and I'll experiment with what I can get away with. Once upon a time, there's a little boy and a little girl that lived in the woods, and they were very happy, and everything was good, and they lived happily ever after. And they'll say,
That's not a story. Tell us a story. Again, they're literary critics at a great age. I'm so proud. So I can make it a story by bringing in an evil villain or a monster or a problem that they have to overcome. And the conflict might be external. The simplest stories, you've got good guys versus the bad guys. Or other kinds of external, the St. George and the Dragon, or pioneer having to deal with prairie fire. That's an external conflict, and the story is about how the character overcomes those. More interesting, perhaps, are stories with internal conflicts, where the conflict is within the character, where the character has to make a decision. Shall I do this or that? Shall I be loyal to my friends, or do I tell on them because they're going to do something very bad? And they're torn inside. Okay. Shall I marry this person or that person? Shall I, to be or not to be? I mean, these are these internal struggles. And a lot of the best literature has a combination of those. You look at something like the Iliad, filled with external conflict, wars and battles and exciting spear fights, and that's really fun. But it's also about the internal conflict. In fact, Homer says that it's about, I sing the wrath of Achilles. But what the story is really about, yes, there's lots of good fighting and exciting battles between these super warriors, but it's about Achilles' anger, because here he's the greatest warrior of them all, but he gets mad because the king hurts his feelings and doesn't respect him, so he sulks in his tent for most of the story. And then when he finally, his friend puts on his armor so they think he's Achilles, and they kill him, and Achilles is mad, and then he comes out. But being the real heart of the story is within the character, and even within the other characters. Hector, the Trojan hero. Achilles is fighting for glory. Hector is fighting to protect his family. So different. Which gets us into a character. Maybe I'll return to that example. So the plot is a conflict, and then it goes somewhere. Typically, the beginning of the story, there's an exposition, just introducing us to the characters and the situation, and who's who, and then the conflict is introduced, and then there's a complication. Not just a fight, there's something that happens that makes it harder to deal with. So the conflict isn't, the plot thickens, as we say. It doesn't just end and they fight and one person wins. No, there's a conflict, but then we learn that the villain is the brother of the one you love, the warrior loves. And so if he kills him, what is that going to do to the one he loves? And you can see how it gets more and more complicated. Typically, the conflict builds to a turning point where the conflict is resolved one way or another. There's the battle, the good guy wins. But then we have to see the consequences of that. We have to see the resolution. What is that going to do? What is this great victory going to do to the woman he loves? He's just killed her brother. Okay, see, the conflict is resolved, but now what happens? Milton's turning point of Paradise Lost is Eve reaching for the fruit takes it. That's not the end of the story. That's the middle of the story. Typically, the turning point is in the middle. Then we see the consequences of that. And very often, there's a reversal where, certainly in Paradise Lost, where Adam and Eve repent of what they've done and turn back to God. And then that sets off another set of consequences, including the part about the promise that one greater man than Adam is going to restore us. This is in that line. So anyway, exposition, complication, the resolution often ends with an epiphany, with a realization. You see that in mystery stories, or the very end, you see who did the murder. Oh, now it all makes sense. But a lot of times there is a different kind of epiphany about maybe love or friendship or duty or anyway. Now notice in literature, the form, remember classical approaches emphasize form. Form is always connected to meaning. Form establishes meaning, just like a sonnet. There's a conflict, well, even in the first 8 lines of the sonnet, and then there's a resolution in the last 6. The form establishes the meaning. It's not just a little moral you can pick up at the end. It's taking us through a vicarious experience. It's putting us through a meditation. But anyway, as you're studying even simple stories, you attend to the structure, the plot, and where it's going. Now again, characters may be even more important. Some characters are we say they're flat. That means you're just one-dimensional. Good guys wear white hats, bad guys wear black hats. And there's a big fight, the good guys win. We don't ever get inside any of the characters. They're all flat. And, they can be interesting. It can be a good story, but there's just not much to it. Okay, a lot of times those aren't stories. They can watch Saturday cartoons, and you don't need to study those. Although you can draw on them and talk about, well, look, okay, here's the bad guy. What does he do that makes him bad? What does he do that's bad in the story? Well, he's a monster. Well, what does he do that's monstrous? Well, he's really ugly, and he has these fangs. And again, see, it's all superficial. It's all external. And you can get students to appreciate that. Notice he never really does anything bad in the showing. Better, again, these are stock characters, just stereotype characters appear over and over. And even in a complicated work, there are minor characters. In a Shakespeare play, well, bad example. In a typical play, you've got the main characters, then you've got the extras, the spear carriers, the people that bring out the food at the feast. You don't get to know them, although in Shakespeare, a lot of times you do. So that's one of the things that make him so great. Even the minor characters come out with these flashes of individual personality. But more interesting are the round characters, or rounded characters. These are characters that we do get inside them, and they're complicated, and they have different qualities. Maybe it's the villain, but maybe the villain has some nice qualities, as well as all his bad qualities. He's a professional killer, but he really is nice to his dog. And so you've got these complicated things going on. Or maybe you have a hero who's the good guy battling evil and all this, and yet he's an alcoholic, or he got fired from the police force because he beat up a suspect. He's trying to solve the crime, but he also has burdens of guilt. And people look at him in a way that, anyway, you see the potential. Now, these are the good stories, when they're about the characters, and the plot grows out of the characters, and the characters may change in the course of the work. And that is another thing to really zero in on when you're teaching literature. How does the character change? And very often at the turning point, is it almost a conversion of a character? Or maybe at the epiphany, the character learns something as a realization and becomes a different person. Maybe those are really good things to bring out. Again, they're types of characters. These are all terms from classical literary criticism. Protagonist, again, agon means struggle. That's where we get the word agony. Agon. It literally means wrestling. Wrestlers in the Greek Olympics were agonists. They were fighters. And that reminds us that the characters are dealing with conflicts. So the protagonist is the first struggler, the first agon. The antagonist is the character that the struggle is against. We might say heroes and villains. But really in classical literature, a little more complicated, because, for example, the hero of a tragedy is someone who is admirable, but who has a tragic flaw. The word for flaw is hamartia, and Christians recognize that word. Anybody know what it means? If you study Greek, hamartia? Sin. It's the New Testament word for sin. And so when you're reading about a hero like Oedipus, oh, we admire him. Oh, he's a great figure. But he has a sin that brings on his downfall. And that sin is usually pride. Pride. Ego. Not pride but the pride that puts yourself first and in competition with the gods. So Oedipus, his flaw is that he's proud, and when he comes across somebody else on the path, on the road, he won't stand aside. Oedipus stands aside for no one. I am the great Oedipus. And so, and the other guy is also angry and gets mad. And so they end up fighting, and Oedipus kills him, and it turns out, spoiler alert, this was his long-lost father that he killed. Again, boy, notice how similar in personalities they are. Neither one will back down. And anyway, it only gets worse from that for poor Oedipus. But people misinterpret the idea of hero. Oh, they think a hero is somebody that's always good. No, a hero can have a flaw. And the whole interest in the story is, yes, we care about it, we identify with this hero, but we have to come to terms with his flaw, and that makes us see our own flaws. And there are other characters who are foils. They bring out qualities in the hero. You have Don Quixote and his faithful companion, the comical sidekick, Sancho Panza. And although Sancho Panza is probably the your favorite character there, and he's a complex, rounded character too, but he's kind of a foil for the mad knight who brings out the knight's quality, who he can talk with, and it helps us to know him better. Point of view. A story will tend to present the action from a certain point of view, from a character's point of view. So another thing to notice is whose mind are we in? Whose eyes are we seeing through? It might be the protagonist, it might be a minor character who's describing things that he's witnessing. It could be the antagonist, I suppose, although point of view character is probably going to be the protagonist, but it could be the villain, in other words. And this is what teaches us empathy and the ability to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, to imagine ourselves in somebody else's situation, to see from that person's point of view. Literature trains us in that. Okay, here's some character. Again, the stock character, the evil villain, or the fantasy superhero. Don't necessarily get inside their minds. Or here's Hamlet, played by Benjamin Cumberbatch, great actor. So complicated, so much going on. Other element, the setting. The action will take place somewhere. Sometimes the setting is just the background. It really doesn't matter too much. Others, it's the whole point of the story. It's the really good thing of the story. It immerses us in a different place, different time, different culture. And it gives us vicarious experience of being in a completely different world. It can be realistic. Maybe the story is set in our own times, but it can be historical. And the author is trying to imagine what it would be like to live in the Middle Ages or in Victorian England, Victorian London on the streets. And again, a lot of the pleasure of reading is the imaginative experience of the setting. And the fantasy, it can be a completely non-realistic setting. It can be an imaginary world. It can be science fiction or fantasy or Middle Earth or mythic. If you're reading some of the classic literature, there is a form today I kind of get a kick out of, magical realism, that writes really super realistically about fantasy, or fantasy intrudes on a very realistic story. A lot of the Latin American writers are good with this, like Garcia Marquez, where you'll have this grim little Mexican village, and all of a sudden an angel falls out of the sky, and what are we going to do with this angel? But the angel has lice in its feathers, in its wings. No, this combination of realism and fantasy is kind of you can do some interesting things with it. Here's some settings. Science fiction and fantasy, very similar, really. They seem different because the scientific one, instead of using magic, it makes up science, so giving the plausibility, and it aims at the future. Fantasy is made up. It uses magic. It often is set in the past. But I mean, the Star Wars, science fiction, galaxy far, far away. But notice they're fighting with swords. Yeah. Made out of light, but they're swords. They're wearing armor. Okay, it's spacesuits, but it's actually armor. And it's interesting to a whole line of where you see how the elements and the conventions play back and forth. Or you can have historical. Miss Jane Austen. Okay, and then the theme. I'm going to go quickly. I'll convey an idea. Sidney said, function of literature to teach and delight, to teach by delighting, not to teach by preaching. I mean, preaching is one form, but if a work of literature starts preaching, it kind of stops being literature. So the trick is to have something that's delightful, that the students really enjoy, and yet he's learning something from it. There's intentional themes, there's purposes, there's implicit themes. But the author is not intending, but what the reader picks up from. And here we can get into, tying it to our own times or our own values as Christians. Here's this agonizing story, and we think, wow, notice, never mentioned God once. Okay? This must be what it's like to live without God. No wonder his life has no meaning, and he gives up on everything and everybody. And again, no, that wasn't what the author's intending, but those are very valuable conversations that you can have about the bigger meaning of the work. Okay, quickly, a few minutes, enter in the trivium. Again, grammar level, cultivate the memory, learn the elements, develop a love of language. Recitations. Hey, how about those recitations last night? How about the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere? 7-year-old memorizing this long, going on for 7 minutes and putting in the emotions to it. Amazing. That's what they can do at that stage. You can teach them the grammar, again, the rhythm and rhyme schemes. Again, this is how Spencer says, twinkle, twinkle, little star. Take a line, have them mark the rhythm, have them mark the rhyme scheme. Now I wonder what you, little star, I wonder what you are. Okay, so do the same thing. You can teach them to do that, and that's that's teaching poetic form on the sort of the grammar of literature. Good material, fairy tales, folk tales, nursery rhymes, or classic children's poems and stories. Notice that the recitations, there was a lot from Robert Louis Stevenson and from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Great writers, great poets who write very easy and sometimes for children, and it's just good material for them to learn. But if you want other examples, at the CCLE website, there is a section on quality literature, broken down by age groups. It includes classics, it includes more modern works, and all works that are very good to study. Logic, to learn to think about literature and to think by means of literature. Again, I say that Dorothy Sayers talks about the developmental approach, but I believe that you can and should employ the trivium to some degree at every level. Even with very young children, okay, they're at the grammar stage. That doesn't mean you just make them memorize stuff. Maybe that's primarily where they are. But you can help them at some level to understand something of what they've learned. And you can get them to, you can apply rhetoric to what they've learned, where they can talk about the poem, or talk about or write their own poem based on that. So I encourage you to do that. There are a lot of fun exercises. Again, logic, as well as understanding, Luther's question, what does this mean? Dialectic, talking about it, guided discussion. To that stage, middle school, they can start beginning some of the bigger classics, and they can start taking on works with serious themes and ideas. Rhetoric, again, the fun thing that you can do with rhetoric and literature, classical literature curriculum, is have the students, having studied literature, then to write their own, to try it themselves. For the students or the literary authors, the classical techniques, imitatio, imitate. Okay, here we're reading Longfellow. Okay, write 4 lines where you're sounding like Longfellow in this poem, where you imitate the author's style. It's very instructive, and you learn a lot both about the author and about writing. I talked about the Progymnasmata, which is a series of imaginative writing exercises. Again, teach them to write in the various poetic forms. You read a ballad, write a ballad. You're studying a hymn, write a hymn. You're studying a sonnet, write a sonnet. You're studying stories, okay, you write a story using all the elements, plot, character, and you could even specify and do different kinds of characters and different kinds of plots. Write a fantasy story, write a realistic story set in this school. Anyway, it's very fun, and they like it too, and you can learn a lot. And then they can read and discuss each other's works as if they too were great authors, which maybe they are or will be someday. Okay, other resources. The Curriculum Resource Guide for Classical Lutheran Education will direct you to reading lists and what's appropriate, curriculum, different DIS. I wrote this book some time ago, Reading Between the Lines, A Christian Guide to Literature. That one will go into a lot more detail about things I've talked about in these last 3 days. So that can be maybe a reference. And it takes up specific works of literature too, and shows what you can do with them. All right, well, thank you, and happy reading, happy teaching.